Not really one of us, my aunt told the mediator, her voice soft and reasonable, the way you'd describe a misunderstanding over a dinner reservation. She was a foster placement that never got finalized, a loose end, honestly. My uncle nodded along beside her. A clerical thing from years back. Nobody ever fixed it. I didn't say a word. I didn't reach for my water glass. I didn't even glance at the folder in front of me. And then the mediator set down her pen, looked over the top of her glasses, and asked their attorney one quiet question. "Counsel, are you telling me your clients don't know who this woman is?" The room went still. My aunt's reasonable smile faltered at the corners. And for the first time since I'd walked in, my uncle looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. I'd learned a long time ago that the people who are most afraid of you are the ones who keep insisting you're nobody. You can hear it in how often they say it. The mediation took place in a beige conference room on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Columbus, the kind of office with motivational prints on the wall and a coffee machine that nobody trusted. There were no robes, no gavel, no raised platform. Just a long table, a box of tissues placed hopefully in the center, and a woman named in the documents as the neutral facilitator, hired because the family couldn't get through a phone call without somebody hanging up. My aunt sat directly across from me. She'd dressed for sympathy, a soft grey cardigan, a small gold cross, reading glasses she didn't need pushed up into her hair. She had a way of folding her hands that made her look patient, almost saintly, like she was the one being inconvenienced by all of this. My uncle sat beside her in a polo shirt, arms crossed, jaw set, the picture of a man who'd rather be at the lake. Their lawyer was younger than I expected, a guy who clearly billed by the hour and clearly believed his clients. He had a leather portfolio and a stack of tabbed pages, and the easy confidence of someone who'd already decided how the morning would go. My own attorney sat to my right with a single legal pad and a pen she hadn't uncapped yet. She didn't look at me. We'd talked it through twice already. She knew I wasn't going to flinch, and I knew she wasn't going to rush. The facilitator read the matter into the record in a flat, practiced voice. A dispute over the estate of the deceased. A question of whether a certain individual held standing as an heir. A challenge to my relationship to the woman who'd raised me. My grandmother. Their lawyer went first. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and gave a little speech about how everyone here wanted what was fair, how grief made people do irrational things, how it was understandable that I might feel entitled to something after all these years, but the simple fact, he said, is that my client's mother never legally adopted the petitioner. She took her in, yes. She was generous, yes. That was her nature. But generosity isn't the same as family. And it certainly isn't the same as inheritance. He said the word petitioner like it was a job title. Like I was a vendor who'd shown up to dispute an invoice. I let it sit. I'd gotten good at letting things sit. My aunt leaned forward then, doing the soft voice again. "We're not trying to be cruel," she said to the facilitator. "Not to me. We just think there's been confusion. Our mother was elderly. She got attached to people. The girl was around the house for a while, and somewhere along the line some paperwork got, sloppy. Insurance forms, a beneficiary line here and there. It snowballed." She shook her head sadly. "It's nobody's fault, really, but it's not the truth of things." The girl. I was 31 years old. I kept my hands flat on the table and my eyes on the facilitator. I'd spent 4 years as a paramedic before I went back to school, and one thing that work teaches you fast is that panic is a choice you can decline. You learn to keep your voice level while everything around you comes apart, because the second you raise it, you've handed the situation over to the loudest person in the room. I wasn't going to be the loudest person in the room. I was going to be the most accurate one. The facilitator listened to all of it. She took notes. She let my aunt finish. And then she did the thing that changed the temperature of the entire morning. She turned to their lawyer and asked, in that same even tone, "Counsel, are you telling me your clients don't know who this woman is?" It wasn't an accusation. That's what made it land. It was just a question, the kind you ask when something on the page isn't adding up. The lawyer's pen stopped moving. I'm sorry, your clients have characterized the petitioner as a foster placement that was never finalized. A stranger, essentially. I'm asking whether that's the position they want on the record. She slid a page toward him. Because there's a document here that suggests otherwise, and I'd like to be sure everyone understands what they're claiming before we go any further. I watched my uncle's eyes drop to the table. My aunt's smile held, but it had gone brittle, the way thin ice holds for exactly 1 second before it doesn't. The lawyer started. We'd like a short break to confer with our clients. Of course, the facilitator said. 15 minutes. My aunt was already gathering her cardigan around her like a woman leaving church. She didn't look at me as she passed. She didn't need to. She still believed this was a formality, that whatever was on that page could be explained away with enough soft words and a sympathetic facilitator. People always believe that, right up until the moment they don't. My lawyer waited until the door clicked shut. You okay? She asked. I'm fine, I said. And I was. My pulse was steady. I'd checked it out of habit. She gave a small nod. They just told a federal mediator that your grandmother didn't know who you were. That's going to be hard to walk back. I knew that. I'd known it the moment my aunt said the word stranger. Strangers don't get described in 3 separate beneficiary forms over 11 years. Strangers don't get a handwritten letter, folded into the back of a Bible. But I didn't say any of that out loud. I'd learned that the people on the other side of a table will hang themselves with their own confidence if you just give them enough rope and enough quiet. I want to be clear about something, because the easy version of this story is the wrong one. I didn't grow up unwanted. I grew up with the one person who decided, without being asked, that I belonged to her. My mother left when I was 6. I don't say that for sympathy, and I won't pretend it was simple. She had problems that were bigger than me, the kind that pull a person under no matter how much they love what they're leaving. My father had been gone before I could form a memory of him. So when my mother disappeared the second time, the time that stuck, the county didn't have a lot of options. My grandmother had options, though. She had a 3-bedroom house on a quiet street in a suburb of Cincinnati, a pension from 30 years of teaching, and a spine made out of something the rest of the family apparently didn't inherit. She drove to the county office herself. I remember sitting on a plastic chair, swinging my legs, watching her sign things and ask hard questions and refuse to leave until somebody gave her a straight answer. She brought me home that afternoon. She made me grilled cheese. She told me my room was the one with the window facing the maple tree, and that the maple turned the color of fire in October, and that I should always sleep with the curtain open so I'd never miss it. I lived in that room until I left for college. Here's the thing the family conveniently forgot at that conference table. My grandmother tried to adopt me. Formally. Twice. The first time, the paperwork stalled because my mother, somewhere out there, wouldn't sign the termination, and you can't finalize without that, not back then. The second time my mother had passed, and the caseworker told my grandmother it was mostly a formality at that point, that I was nearly 14 and the placement was stable and the system had bigger fires to put out. So the formal adoption never closed, not because anyone doubted what we were, because a stack of forms sat in a drawer in an office in a county that was chronically understaffed. My aunt knew all of this. She'd been at Thanksgiving every year. She'd watched my grandmother introduce me as her granddaughter to every neighbor, every doctor, every pharmacist, every stranger at the grocery store. She'd seen the photos on the wall. She just decided after the funeral that an unfinished form was a door she could walk through. The house was paid off. There was a retirement account that had done well. There was the kind of modest, real money that a careful teacher accumulates over a lifetime of not spending it on herself. It wasn't a fortune. It was enough to fight over, which is somehow always worse. When the break ended, we filed back into the beige room. The coffee nobody trusted had gone cold. The facilitator folded her hands. Before we continue, she said, I want to give your clients an opportunity to revise their characterization of the petitioner if they'd like to. She looked at the lawyer. Or to stand by it. The lawyer cleared his throat. My clients maintain that there was no formal adoption, which is, as a matter of law, accurate. Noted, the facilitator said. And the rest of it? The suggestion that she was a stranger to the deceased? There was a pause, a long one. My uncle shifted in his chair. My aunt, who had clearly been coached during the break, put on the soft voice again. We may have spoken too strongly, she said. It was an emotional situation, but the legal point stands. It does, the facilitator agreed. So let's talk about the documents. My attorney finally uncapped her pen. She didn't raise her voice. She just started laying things on the table one at a time, and the room got quieter with each one. A life insurance policy designating me as primary beneficiary, signed and notarized when I was 19. A transfer on death deed on the house, filed with the county recorder, naming me. A retirement account with a beneficiary form updated 4 years ago, the date written in my grandmother's careful schoolteacher cursive. Each one had been completed correctly. Each one named me not as a foster child, not as a placement, but by my full name, the name I share with no one in that room, because it was the name I was born with, and my grandmother had never tried to erase it. She just added herself underneath it, in the only ways the law would let her. These are sloppy? My attorney asked, not unkindly. 11 years of consistent, notarized, legally filed documents are an accident? My aunt's mouth opened and then closed, and then my attorney placed the last thing on the table. A single sheet of paper, handwritten, in the same cursive. A letter my grandmother had written and kept folded in the back of her Bible, the one the funeral home returned to me in a plastic bag with her glasses and her watch. The letter wasn't legally binding. My attorney was careful to say that out loud. It wasn't a will. It didn't move a single dollar on its own, but it explained, in my grandmother's own words, exactly who I was to her and exactly what she intended. And she had been a teacher for 30 years, so she'd written it the way she did everything. Clearly, with no room for misreading. The facilitator asked if she could read it into the record. I said yes. I'm not going to repeat the whole thing. Some of it belongs to me. But there was one line near the end, and I watched my aunt's face as the facilitator read it. My grandmother had written that the saddest thing she could imagine wasn't dying. It was the idea that after she was gone, someone might try to tell me I hadn't really been hers. She wrote that if that day ever came, I should remember that she'd chosen me on purpose in a county office on a Tuesday with no one making her do it, and that a piece of paper she never got to sign didn't change a single thing about that. My uncle put his hand over his mouth. My aunt looked down at the table and didn't look up. The facilitator set the letter down gently. She let the silence do its work. Then she folded her hands again and spoke to both attorneys, but really she was speaking to my aunt and uncle. Here is where we are, she said. There is no formal adoption. Your attorney is correct about that. And if this goes to probate litigation, that fact will be in your favor on exactly one narrow question: intestate inheritance. But there is no intestacy here, because your mother did not die without a plan. She left a house with a recorded transfer on death deed. She left an insurance policy with a named beneficiary. She left a retirement account with a beneficiary designation. None of those passed through the will. None of those care whether an adoption was finalized. They go to the named person by operation of law, and the named person is sitting at this table. My aunt's lawyers started to say something about the will itself, the residual estate, the bank accounts not covered by the deed and the designations. You're welcome to pursue those, the facilitator said. I'm here to help you understand what you'd be pursuing. You'd be spending the next 18 months and a significant amount of money to litigate the smallest piece of this, while on the record, after telling a neutral party that your mother didn't know her own granddaughter, against a stack of notarized documents and a letter in her own hand. She let that sit. I facilitated a lot of these. I'm telling you what I see, but it's your decision. I watched my aunt do the math. Not the money, the exposure. She was a woman who lived on being seen as reasonable, as the patient one, the saintly one in the grey cardigan with the cross. And she just heard, out loud in a room with a record, what she actually looked like. That was the moment it ended. Not with a verdict, with arithmetic. They asked for another break. When they came back, the lawyer said his clients were prepared to acknowledge the validity of the beneficiary designations and the deed, and that they'd like to discuss the residual estate, the leftover accounts, separately and in good faith. In good faith, my attorney repeated, and I heard the smallest amount of dry humour in it. Sure. Here's where people expect the story to turn into something it didn't. They expect me to have taken everything, to have pointed at the 11 years and the lies and the grey cardigan and said, no, you get nothing. You don't even get to keep the dignity of pretending. And I'll be honest, there was a version of me in that chair who wanted to, who'd driven up from my apartment that morning with that version riding shotgun. But I'd already decided, weeks before, that I wasn't going to scorch the ground I had to keep standing on. The house was mine. The policy was mine. The retirement account was mine. Those weren't up for negotiation because my grandmother had made them not up for negotiation on purpose, knowing this family. The residual estate, the bank accounts that weren't covered, came to a little under $40,000. I told my attorney to split it, half to me, half divided between my aunt and uncle. My attorney looked at me for a second longer than she usually did. You don't have to do that. I know, I said. They'd have taken all of it. I know that too. I didn't do it because I forgave them. I want to be precise, because forgiveness is a word people throw around to make endings feel cleaner than they are. I did it because my grandmother spent 30 years teaching kids who weren't hers to read, and I'd never once heard her humiliate a person who'd already lost. Taking that last $40,000 wouldn't have honoured her. It would have just made me feel powerful for an afternoon, and I've learned that's the most expensive feeling there is. You pay for it later, in the quiet. The paperwork took the better part of 3 months. That's the part nobody tells you about. The drama is one morning. The administration is a season. There were title transfers and account closures and a dozen forms that asked me to certify, under penalty of perjury, that I was who I'd always known I was. I signed every one of them with the name my grandmother never changed and never needed to. My aunt sent me a card afterward. Cream-colored, expensive, the kind you buy in a set. Inside, in handwriting that tried very hard to look warm, she'd written that she hoped we could put all this behind us and that family was what mattered most in the end. I read it twice. Then I put it in the drawer with the unfinished adoption forms because that's where the documents that don't mean anything go. My uncle, to his small credit, called. He didn't apologize either. Not really. Men in that family don't seem to have the wiring for it. But he said something close. He said he'd let himself believe the easy version because the easy version was cheaper. I told him I understood, because I did. The easy version is always cheaper, right up until the bill comes. I used part of the insurance money to do something I'd been thinking about for a long time. I went back and finished my nursing degree, the one I'd started and paused when the money ran thin. And then I set aside a small amount, not a lot, just enough to matter. And I started a fund through my old paramedic agency. It pays for the recertification fees and the textbooks for foster kids who age out of the system and want to go into emergency medicine. Kids the system was too overstretched to finish the paperwork for. I didn't put my name on it, I put hers. I think about that conference room sometimes. Not the part where I won, because winning isn't really the word for it. I think about the question the facilitator asked. Are you telling me your clients don't know who this woman is? She was asking the lawyer, but she might as well have been asking the whole family, every person who'd watched my grandmother introduce me as hers for 25 years, and then decided, when there was money on the table, that they'd suddenly developed amnesia. They knew exactly who I was. That was never the problem. The problem was that knowing it cost them something, and they hoped, for one beige morning in a downtown office, that they could pretend not to. You can't erase a person by losing their paperwork. My grandmother taught me that without ever sitting me down to say it. She taught it to me with grilled cheese and a window facing a maple tree in a county office on a Tuesday. The forms were never what made me hers. The forms were just the part the world kept dropping. If you've ever had someone try to tell you that you don't belong where you know you belong, that the love you got doesn't count because it didn't come through the proper channel, I want you to hear this. You don't have to raise your voice to be right. You don't have to take everything to prove you are owed something. Sometimes you just have to sit very still, keep your records, and wait for the moment somebody asks the question out loud. And then you let the truth answer it for you. I still keep the unfinished adoption forms in that drawer, right next to my aunt's cream-coloured card. For a long time, I thought of them as proof of something missing. Now I understand they were never the thing that mattered. My grandmother knew that before I did. She drove to a county office on a Tuesday when nobody asked her to, and she signed what she could sign. And when the system couldn't finish the rest, she filled the gap herself, year after year, with notarized forms and a window facing a maple tree and grilled cheese on a Sunday. None of that required permission. That was the lesson hiding underneath the whole ordeal, and it took me 31 years in a beige conference room to finally see it. The reason that morning ended the way it did wasn't luck. My aunt and uncle reached for the easy version because it was cheaper, and the easy version collapsed the moment it met the record. Cause and effect. They said the word stranger to a neutral party, and a stranger doesn't appear in 11 years of careful paperwork. They built their whole case on a thing they hoped no one would check, and someone checked. You don't get to skip the work and keep the reward. Life keeps better books than that. What carried me through it wasn't anger, and I want to be honest about that, because anger would have been easier and a lot louder. It was 3 quieter things. The first was simply refusing to do the dishonorable thing when I had every excuse to. I could have taken that last 40,000 and felt powerful for an afternoon. I split it instead, not because they earned it, but because my grandmother never once humiliated a person who'd already lost, and I wasn't going to start being someone she wouldn't recognize. The second was learning to think before I reacted, to keep my records, to let the facts speak so I didn't have to shout. Panic is a choice you can decline. So is revenge. The third was the plain stubbornness to sit still in that chair, pulse steady, and wait for the truth to find its own moment instead of forcing it. If you take anything from what happened to me, let it be this. Be the kind of person who keeps their word and their receipts. Be patient enough to let the loud people exhaust themselves. And be strong enough to stop short of cruelty even when cruelty is within reach, because the version of you that wins by destroying someone is not a version you get to put down later. It follows you home. They knew exactly who I was. They always had. The forms were just the part the world kept dropping, and my grandmother spent her whole life teaching me that the people worth being are the ones who pick those things back up. I'm still trying to be that person. Some Tuesdays I get it right.